Hey everybody, it's Meredith Miller from Inner Integration here with your Sana Q&As. This question says, Meredith, I heard you speak about the cluster B folks and this sort of new age spiritual deception thing that some have going on. I realized during the past few months I am the daughter of a narc mother, and I'm figuring out my husband, I believe, has borderline personality something going on. I am an absolute wreck of self-doubt and the worst time navigating denial, acceptance, and trying to build courage to live a better life. My husband has always been emotionally and psychologically abusive, and now 11 years later is starting to admit it and is getting help. Only thing is, it's sounding a whole lot like a bunch of blame shifting, responsibility dodging, and pseudo spirituality conflation. Could you speak more on this? Sure. So there's two different questions today on the spiritual kind of narcissist. So apparently this is going on right now. A lot of people are asking this question. This is something that's been going on for a long time. I think there's more and more awareness of this now. What you usually find in these spiritual types of narcs is the more covert types, usually the covert narcissist and sociopath. Every now and then you'll see a psychopath though, and sometimes you'll see the borderline types as well. So it's good that your husband is admitting the 11 years of emotional abuse and he's starting to get help. The important thing though is what new action is he taking as a result of that? Or is he just justifying his victimhood more and holding that over your head? You know, you talked about blame shifting, responsibility dodging, and pseudo spirituality conflation. So that makes my ears perk up, and I wonder, you know, is he just playing you, or is he actually working on getting better? So you really want to be careful with that. You know, is he just justifying it more? Is he now trying to make it all your fault, or the fault, you know, of the childhood abuse, which is usually what happens with the borderline type. And now, every time I talk about borderline, I get all kinds of hate mail and hate comments and people telling me how wrong I am and what a horrible, you know, example of a professional, and I'm not a professional. I know nothing about it. I know nothing about who they are. And, you know, I should just have been aborted. That was the best one. I should have been aborted instead of being born because I'm just a horrible human being. Like, these sorts of comments will happen when I talk about borderline personality disorder, and I'm not going to stop talking about it because I have worked with a lot of people who have been targets, partners of people with borderline personality disorder, and they have been severely emotionally abused. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to say this as I'm going to say it because I'm going to be real here and just expect that there's going to be plenty of hateful comments. So, you know, the thing is that the borderline of the cluster B types, you know, they're all similar in that they all have some sort of narcissistic tendencies. The borderline's narcissistic tendency tends to be more of, you know, poor me, it's so hard to be me, you don't know how hard it is to be me, everybody should just do what I want. That's very narcissistic. It's just justifying, you know, the victimhood, the pity card. So be careful, that's usually how it comes across. And so if your husband's like, well, you know, I'm in therapy now and it's just, you know, you don't know how hard it was to be abused or neglected like me in childhood, when you probably have been through something similar, you know, because if you find yourself in one of these relationships, it tends to be that you've developed codependency patterns in childhood due to one or both of your parents being a cluster B or other manipulative person or alcoholic, addict, who then behaves in a narcissistic way because the alcohol, the bottle, the addiction is their absorption, you know, and they can't be there with you. They can't provide the kinds of emotional support that a parent needs to provide to a child. So remember, having been a victim does not justify someone to go ahead and abuse more people. That's not justification. So if he's blame shifting in that way, that's not right. I would not allow that. So, you know, be very careful of what he's presenting to you. And it's very important to recognize, is he accepting self-responsibility or not? Like someone is getting better if they're accepting self-responsibility for their attitudes and their actions, and then if they're taking new action to show you in real time that they're changing. If not, they're not changing. First of all, if they can't even accept the self-responsibility, they're not going to change. If it's all everybody else's fault and poor me and I'm the victim and blame everybody else, there's no chance for change there. No chance until the shift happens between putting the blame outside and accepting self-responsibility for oneself now. It doesn't mean it's their fault what happened in childhood, just like it wasn't your fault what happened to you in childhood. The best thing we can do right now is to take the self-responsibility, grab the reins of our destiny in our hands, and create the life and destiny that we actually want to create. That starts with self-responsibility. If we can't be responsible for our attitudes, our feelings, our actions, there's no hope for change. No hope. And just like Dr. George Simon says, well, how do you know? I asked him, how do you know if someone's changing? He said they're changing in real time. They're taking new action, and they're not taking new covert aggressive action. They're not going to therapy and getting smarter and learning how to be more covert with their abuse, which often happens if a narcissist, a psychopath, a sociopath finds themselves in therapy. It's usually that they end up becoming more dangerous because they gain more tools how to more covertly abuse people. So if you're not seeing evidence of accepting self-responsibility and evidence of him changing his ways, nothing's happening. You know, is he acknowledging how you felt as a result of his behavior? Or is he just playing on that pity card? Poor me, it's so hard to be me, it's so much pain, you just don't know. You know, what is it? Because if he's not acknowledging how you felt, then he has no empathy. It's all about him. Empathy is you feel someone else. You can put yourself in someone else's shoes. You can imagine how they feel. If he's like, man, when I did that to you, I'm so sorry. I didn't even realize what I was doing. You must have felt awful. You must have felt whatever. I'm so sorry. Like that person has having empathy. They're realizing they messed up. They hurt you. They didn't mean to hurt you at the time. And usually the borderline doesn't mean to hurt you. The sociopath very much means to hurt you. The sociopath is sadistic. They plan things. Oftentimes narcissists are the same way. So sometimes what they call the lesser narcissists, they're just more going on impulse. They're not really cognitively planning, intending things. Though Dr. George Simon says all manipulation is conscious, that the parts of the brain you use to manipulate someone, it's a conscious part of the brain. It doesn't happen without that. Though there have been times when I have seen, particularly the borderline types, doing more impulsive actions. Like they just didn't think, they just did it. And then maybe they regretted for a minute later, but then usually a couple hours or days later, now they're justifying why they did it, or pretending like they didn't do it, or pretending like it was all your fault. They acted that way anyway. So is he acknowledging how you felt during those 11 years of abuse, you know, or is it just all about him and poor him and you don't know how hard it is to be him? Sometimes what you'll find with these types is like, you know, maybe the spiritual type talks incessantly and they just want you to listen, and maybe they're like the spiritual leader, or maybe they're just the spiritual student. But the spiritual student then comes home or goes into his or her little community, which are not spiritual students. So now they want to play the leader. And so they just talk incessantly. And it's more like they're delivering this lecture about things. They just want you to listen and listen and listen. But then when you talk, they're barely listening. Like, especially if you reveal something profound, like whatever you were talking about, and then you add to that and you reveal something profound, they'll usually just gloss right over it like it's unimportant or meaningless. Maybe they'll even put it right down. Or usually they'll like to top it off with how they're the best, or how they did that but more, yet playing the most humble. Because the spiritual type of narc often plays that really overly humble role. You know, I just really just want to do it, you know, just to help other people, and I just want to, and they're just going on and on and on about that all the time, you know, versus maybe they said it once or twice. No, this is the person that says it on, and they're really playing that humble thing, which is confusing. And then you don't recognize that's actually a covert narcissist hiding in the sheep's clothing. Maybe they play the most spiritually advanced or enlightened. They go into whatever group, or you guys go out with your friends to dinner, and they go into this role of the most spiritually advanced and enlightened, and they're like schooling everybody there. Maybe people don't even care. Maybe they don't even want to know about that stuff, but they just go on, and they're not tuning into what's that called? Social cues. Like, do people care? Are they paying attention? Like, generally when you're talking with someone, especially if you're a codependent, you have like usually a really good read on, are they listening? Do they care? Do they want to talk about this? Or should we stop talking about this? There's not really that connection. When you see people moving away from you, they're not interested. They don't want to talk in that. And often when these types are talking at you, because they're not talking with you, it's not conversation, it's a monologue. And they're just talking at you with all of this, and everybody is just kind of going like this and like trying, and they're being polite, like, but they just really don't want to be there, and they don't even recognize these social cues because they don't care. They don't have the empathy that tunes into that and says, oh, this isn't the crowd for that. They're not really feeling, let me just wind that down. So how about the Raiders, and talk about something else, whatever. They're not going to do that. They're just going to keep going. The spiritual type also loves to tell you, like, say there's a problem and you recognize the problem, and it could be a problem in your family, a problem in the household, a problem in your relationship. It could be a problem in society that you've noticed, and typically what the spiritual kind of narcissist will tell you is everything's perfect, man. It's exactly as it should be. No worries. Stop talking about all that negative stuff. Just be positive, man. Light and love, man. And this just, it's setting you up to be helpless and hopeless and powerless, to not take any action, to not take the reins of your destiny in your hand, to just surrender to some sort of, there's no such thing as free will. Everything is exactly as it should be. That's a really popularly abused mantra by the spiritual types of sociopaths. They try to convince you that, well, it was supposed to happen like that, so you were supposed to get screwed, and they were supposed to do that, and it's okay because it's just how it's supposed to be. Or that big problem that you see outside of you in society, just don't worry. Just pretend like it's not even there. Don't even try to create any kind of change there. Just be positive that everything's perfect the way it is. So they love to play that card, and then they love to tell you and shame you. You're just negative. You're just always going to talk about negative things when you're trying to talk about ways of changing, like, this isn't right and we need to create some change, and they're just telling you not to talk about that kinds of stuff. And so then in your relationship, it's like you don't talk about the big stuff because everything's just as it should be. Everything's perfect. Just be positive, man. You're ruining my peace. When you want to talk about stuff, like plenty of those kinds of narcissists, so they don't let you talk about feelings, being upset, problems. They just want you to stop. Just sweep it under the rug, pretend like everything's okay. Sometimes the spiritual types, what you'll find, usually not the teachers, usually more the students, maybe like they're not working and they're completely broke, and you start dating them and they talk about how money isn't important and it's, the representation of all evil and, blah, blah, blah. And then they expect you to pay for everything because someone has to give them a free ride, because they don't work and they're completely broke, but they're justifying that based on being really spiritual, because they confuse that if you have money, you can't be spiritual, and spiritual people don't have money, which is not true at all. Money in itself is not evil. It depends what you do with it. Money is an energy. Money is an energy of exchange of value. It depends how you use it. Money is an amplifier, because if you're an asshole before you have money, you're going to be a bigger asshole when you have money. If you are a beautiful spirit before you have money, and then you have money, you're going to be an even more beautiful spirit, helping even more people. So money in itself is not evil, but they'll like to play that sort of thing, and then they'll expect you to pay for everything because they expect somebody to have money to take care of them, or the government, to support them and everything, whatever. But usually it's like they go on these dates and they talk this all up, and then the check comes. I mean, men especially, I've seen this in a lot of spiritual men, is then they expect you to pick up the tab, or carrying too much of the weight of the money and then maybe you move in with them and you find out like you're supporting everything, like they're not putting in nearly enough, and then you're trapped in that situation and they've really confused and disoriented you about this idea of money. You talked about pseudo spirituality conflation. Love that. Are they living according to their dogma, or are they all talk and no action? You know, that's a good question. Is it pseudo spirituality conflation, or are they just talking and talking this talk, but they're not actually living in accordance with that? So, for example, I had this one mentor who would just talk on and on about, organic food, and it's so important, and his family deserves the best, and he wants his daughter to have the best, and all organic and only organic, and we don't want to have, and then in the kitchen is like all this processed food, not living according to the dogma. So are they living with what they're preaching? Are they living in alignment with that, or are they just a lot of talk and no action? Another one, this is a great one that I've heard from a spiritual psychopath, and I've heard it repeated by other people. They're so enlightened, they just don't get attached to other people like others do. This is often their excuse for not being monogamous. Now, I understand polyamory is like, it's a whole up and coming thing. A lot of people are into that, and I'm not saying that everybody who's into polyamory is a narcissist or sociopath. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that this gets abused by spiritual narcs when they're trying to, instead of just saying like, well, they believe in polyamory and they want to do this, they say it like, I'm just more enlightened than the average bear, and I don't get attached to other people like others do. I love you, but not like you love me, because I don't get attached. And so if you're coming from like a Buddhist background, or maybe even the New Age background where they talk about non-attachment, particularly they're talking about things. They're talking about like material things, not getting attached to things, or not getting attached to the way things are, because life is a constant state of change, right? The only thing for sure we know is that things are changing. And so if you don't have this attachment to things have to be just like this, of course that can lead you to great disappointments, which is probably where the spiritual practice came from. But it gets abused by people like that. They're actually having some sort of attachment disorder. As soon as you get close, they shove you away, and they can't get close to anybody else because of the attachment disorder. But then they'll rest on, I'm better than everyone else. I'm more enlightened than everyone else. I just don't get attached like you lesser people do. That sort of thing. You'll hear that a lot. Sometimes therapy does make them smarter. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. They figure out how to manipulate people more covertly while pretending to show empathy. Because if they're learning all the lingo through the therapy, and then they're saying these things, and they're knowing what to pretend to show you, empathy, compassion, etc. That's the worst sign. Like if you sense him spinning this and using this to make more covert types of manipulation and abuse towards you, that's a really bad sign. That's a sign of more the sociopathic thing, where they're intentionally plotting and planning the covert abuse. So if he's going, or she, anybody, if they're going to a therapist, if they're going to therapy and supposedly getting better, but they're actually just using that education to get better at manipulating, to fly more under the covert radar, you're dealing with a really dangerous person. So I think the overall challenge here is, you said you recognize the childhood patterns. You said you figured out who your mom is. Now you realize why the current patterns are here with your abusive husband, because it's reminding you of your unresolved childhood wound. That's what's repeating in the adult relationships. So now you're at the point where you feel an absolute wreck of self-doubt, and the worst time navigating denial, acceptance, and trying to build courage to live a better life. So things aren't working. You're not okay. You're not okay. You're living in total self-doubt, probably because you've constantly been around people who are getting you to doubt yourself. They're getting you to doubt your intuition. You feel something, you knew something wasn't right, and then you said it and they're like, oh no, that's not what's happening. That's not what I meant. That's not what I did. That's not what happened. You're just crazy. You're just paranoid. All that gaslighting is going to make you self-doubt, right? And then, you have all this denial, because it's really hard to accept that your husband, that your mother is these sorts of people, and in the acceptance, right, of who they are. and you want to live a better life. That's what you're saying. You're trying to build the courage to live a better life. So you know things aren't working. You know you're not okay. So what can you do about it? Do you want to stay in the relationship and continue down that path and hope that he's making positive changes and hope that things are going to get better? Or are you ready to do something different? Maybe taking a break from the marriage, a temporary separation to get distance and perspective, maybe that's a good idea to start with. Maybe give him that chance to actually make changes in his life and his character disturbance. See how that goes. See from a distance and from the perspective, you can see things a lot clearer. I don't know if you've ever even taken like a little vacation away. Any of you who have done that, if you've taken even a long weekend away from the abusive person in your life, and suddenly it's like, whoa, you really get a new perspective on things. That distance is so good for clearing the fog and giving you that new perspective so you can go back and make changes. So sometimes that's all it takes, is getting that little bit of distance, that separation, the new perspective. Maybe you recognize he's not changing at all. Like, he's not making any changes. He's not transforming his character. He's just getting more covert with the abuse, and he's learning better lingo, and he's learning how to justify what he's doing. Maybe his therapist is even empowering him to do that. You don't really know what's going on there. Maybe you notice those kinds of things are just continuing now that you have the distance and the separation. You can really see that's not a good situation. Or maybe you give each other this time and this distance, and maybe you actually see that he is changing. Maybe he actually does transform who he is and the way that he lives and the way that he treats people. That also is going to be more obvious from when you have the distance, and you're going to really recognize if that's going on or not. But just be very cautious about getting back together, because if you get back together and very quickly it goes right back to how it was, then you realize that was just a front. That was more of the idealization, putting on the good behavior, doing the love bombing, talking the good talk, getting you hooked back in, and then going back to the old patterns. If that happens, then that's what that is. And if you stay, you're just going to continue for more of that. Just going to continue that, So if you take the time away, you give yourself that time to start to get to know you, to get to know what you want, who you are, to start that self-healing process, to start rebuilding your self-trust, and then maybe have a date. Don't go to his house or your house, but have a date out in public. Go to dinner, go to do something where you're interactive. Like, don't go see a movie, because that's not going to help you. You're not going to figure anything out if you're both just sitting there watching a movie. But where you can talk, where you can have some sort of interaction, maybe some activity that you guys used to love doing together, that sort of thing, and see how it feels, and see how he's behaving, and see how your body even is responding to that. Does your body feel strong? Does it feel good? Or are you shutting down? Do you feel uncomfortable and stiff and sore? And are you constantly nervous and upset at things he's doing and saying, or do you feel good? So I would recommend taking that distance. Is there even somewhere you can go for a couple weeks? Like, could you just go stay with a relative or a friend who's not abusive, of course? Make sure that you really trust and love this person. Can you go stay there for some time and then come back and see how things are? Have that date, slowly start to reconnect. Or maybe you're at the point, I'm sure this was written several weeks ago by the time I got to it. Maybe now you're at the point where you're done and you really want to take that time away. Maybe you go get your own new place, your own new apartment, and you officially move out and all that. And you'll see over time if this person is really changing or not. It's great that he's getting help, but that doesn't mean he's going to change. It doesn't. It's not always that just because a person gets into therapy, they're going to change and they're going to transform. Because often what will happen is, the cluster B, they'll get into therapy because they're going to lose something. They're going to lose their relationship. They're going to lose their marriage. They're going to lose their child. And they get into therapy and start going in this direction, but then nothing changes. Or they get to that point where now, first it's like the blame is okay. At the beginning, it's okay. We're talking about the childhood and the parents and all this. But once it starts getting to the self-responsibility point, once the therapist actually starts focusing on their actions, on the patient's actions, on their daily attitudes and all of that, that's often when the cluster B person checks out of therapy because they can't take the self-responsibility. That is the across-the-board sign, and it's so funny because it's not in the DSM at all, but I think the across-the-board sign of the cluster B persona is the lack of self-responsibility. They just refuse to accept self-responsibility. That's the first sign of healing. Even for the recovering codependents, it's the first step to healing, because if you can't take the reins of your destiny in your hands, if you can't recognize that what happened in the past, what happened to you in the past as a child by your parents, that was not your fault. What happened to you in abusive relationships where you were abused, that was not your fault, but recognize you have the self-responsibility to transform your life now, to change your life now. You can do something about it. Self-responsibility is self-empowerment. But if you can't take the self-responsibility, your own healing journey doesn't start. You know, this is the person who's in the earlier stages who can only say, oh, it's all the narcissist, it's all the sociopath, it's all the psychopath, it's all the borderline, it's all their fault, they're an evil, horrible human being, and poor me. That person is still stuck in the victimhood. They might be a recovering codependent, but they haven't been able to accept the self-responsibility yet. They're not going to get better. They're just going to keep going in that cycle. They might be taking on too much responsibility in a lot of ways, like they get into the relationship and they feel like it's all their fault, and they keep trying and trying and giving and giving and giving, and they're in this imbalanced give and take relationship. But until they recognize what they have control over, that they are enabling the abuse, until they take the self-responsibility to transform themselves, the healing process doesn't start. It's just a lot of mental masturbation about who the narcissist is and why they're like they are and why they do what they do, and let's find out about the narcissist and, you know, just obsess over the drama of the narcissist. It's just putting all that outside oneself. Everything is outside oneself. You have no control of what's outside of you. You only have control of what's inside of you. So if you want to transform your life, that's where it starts. Equally for the recovering codependent, just as for the cluster B personality spectrum. And that is the predominant barometer for, is this person even capable of change? Can they accept the self-responsibility, or are they just going to keep repeating the same patterns? Right? And so, you know, is this person able to change? You will see that in the present moment. You will see them taking new action. If you know, well, he always did this or she always did this manipulative thing, and you notice they're not doing that anymore. Like, they're actually considering your feelings. You know, they're actually looking to you and asking you, and they're considering you, and they're not just doing that narcissistically self-absorbed sort of thing. They're actually considering you. Then they're showing change. They're changing their behavior. But if they're no longer doing that thing, but then they're just guilt tripping you for not being as forgiving, for not giving them compassion when they're abusing you and this sort of stuff, and pour them from the childhood, they're not changing. They're not changing. They're just justifying who they are based on the past. That's a toxic behavior. So you really got to check in with yourself, because that's all you have control over here. You can't control him. You can't control his healing. You can't love him to be better. Like, your love is not going to save him. Your love is not going to heal him. His own internal decision and choice and action is what's going to heal him or not you. That's entirely out of your control. So I would recommend that you focus on what you do have control over, which is taking care of you. What do you really want? Are you really happy here? Are you going to be able to build courage and live a better life staying in this relationship? Are you going to be able to create more self-trust staying in this relationship? Or do you need to create distance from that relationship in order to take care of yourself? That's the bigger question. That's what you do have control over, and that's what can change your life. I'm sending you a big hug.